Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for a very long overdue case updates video, for which I have a lot of cases to cover today. I keep a list in my notes of updates and cases which I kind of add to whenever I see something new, and I didn't quite realise just how long the list had gotten. Most of the updates I'm going to be sharing are on cases I've covered in the last couple of years, but I'll make sure to give a brief overview of the story behind each so you can sort of refresh your memory, or at least not be completely lost as to what I'm talking about. And of course I'll be linking each original video in the description box down below, so if you want to go and watch the full video, you can. But without further ado, let's get started because I have a lot to get through here. First, I'm going to start with a case I covered just a few months ago in July 2020 and actually got solved in December 2020, and I've received messages about it almost every single day since. Mostly Harmless was a man who went hiking from New York all the way down to Florida until one day his body was found by day hikers in a yellow tent at Big Cypress National Park. He had no identification on him and was thought that he may have been sick for quite a while before his death. Despite there being multiple photos of this man taken by others along his journey, he never once divulged his name, using his trail name of Mostly Harmless or Denim instead when introducing himself. People were baffled. How could a man just die and nobody report him as missing and nobody recognise any of the photos? He was thought to be a very smart man. His notebooks were full of computer code that was very difficult to understand. Now, in some of my previous videos, I've mentioned a company called Othram, a company who do cutting-edge genetic analysis in an attempt to reunite those with their identities. Othram analysed Mostly Harmless's DNA and found some very interesting information from this. They found that he had Cajun roots and that his family had come from Louisiana, and there were links to the name Rodriguez on GEDmatch. But this wouldn't be how his identity would be found. It was actually found through the power of the internet and people sharing his story. This is why I do what I do on the internet, in the hope that one day the right person will see a video and will come forward with information that could help solve it. There's so much importance in just spreading a story. A group of friends in Baton Rouge, Louisiana saw photos of Mostly Harmless on the internet and knew instantly who he was: Vance John Rodriguez. A friend who just went by Marie called the Collier County Sheriff's Office to share this information, saying that not only did she recognise the face, but she also knew his handwriting, his coding style, and had information about this mysterious scar that he had on his abdomen. After testing, I think against Rodriguez's mother's DNA, Othram confirmed that Mostly Harmless was indeed Vance Rodriguez. He was indeed originally from Louisiana, born in February 1967. He had a twin sister, older brother, and a complicated relationship with his parents, particularly with his father. At age 17, Vance got emancipated after a suicide attempt and his parents institutionalised him, and he was not happy. It was through this suicide attempt that he got this scar on his abdomen. Vance was described as exceptionally smart and a computer nerd, as many people online had already deduced from his notebook that was found on him. He was said to suffer with bouts of depression throughout his entire life, and he really struggled with close relationships. A roommate said to Wired that he'd go for a year without smiling or being nice to anyone. He was depressed and moody his entire life. Now, Vance did have a long-term girlfriend whilst he was still living in Baton Rouge, but it was not said to be a good relationship at all. Vance actually described as being very abusive towards her. In 2013, he actually moved to New York City due to meeting another woman. They shared an apartment, but she said to Wired, if something upset him, he would stop talking to me completely, which can be lonely when you share a 500 square foot apartment. She eventually moved out, and it wasn't long after that he set off on his hike, leaving his Brooklyn apartment along with all his personal items and any ID he had. Before he left, he wrote on a Slack channel for Screeps users, which was this coding game that he was suspected of using, "I'm mostly harmless, for now," and then he disappeared. Vance hiked for 15 months, and the strange thing is that everyone on the trail who met him actually described a man completely different from the people who actually knew him did. He was said to be smiley and chatty, everyone liked him, but apparently this was a front that he could put on when he needed to. So, Mostly Harmless, now identified as Vance Rodriguez. He was clearly a deeply flawed and troubled human who may have gone on this hike to sort himself out after his breakup. From what I can gather, his death isn't thought to be any more suspicious now we know his name. It still seems he died from natural causes. He was found emaciated at just 83 pounds. He had struggled with mental health a lot in the past and had attempted suicide before, so maybe he intended to die, or perhaps his body just gave up on him. But at least he now has a name and his friends and family can have an answer as to where he went. And whilst we're on the topic of identified does, I want to share with you that the Sumter County does have also now been identified as Pamela Buckley and James Freund. They were two homicide victims who were found in Sumter County, South Carolina in August 1976. They had each been shot 3 times and were found on Old St. John Church Road in Lynchburg, South Carolina by a truck driver. They had no identification on them, and despite putting out photos and renderings of the does, investigators at the time had no success. Nobody came forward with any information about them. In 2007, the Sumter County coroner, Verna Moore, exhumed the bodies and took DNA samples to try and finally identify them, but the break wouldn't actually come for many years. In 2019, they reached out to the DNA Doe Project, an organisation who do incredible things for identifying does. They also later sent DNA samples to offices in California and Alabama for extraction and comparison. That was in July 2020. This led to the eventual match, 44 years after their deaths, to Pamela and James. Pamela was born in 1951 in Minnesota, but she was last seen and reported missing from Colorado Springs in December 1975. James was born in 1946 and was last seen in the Lancaster, Pennsylvania area. It doesn't seem that he was ever reported as missing. Pamela was 25 and James was 30 when they were killed. Their families have been notified, and that's about all of the information we have on their case for now. And although they are now identified, this case is not solved and there's still no clue as to who murdered them. The investigation is to reopen though, and they're going to follow up on a person of interest that they have, which is very positive. They apparently have a couple of people to look into here. And hopefully on the back of this, the pair will get justice. It's asked that anyone who has information contact the Sumter County Sheriff's Office. I'll leave the information for that in the description box down below. And whilst we're on the topic of does, I want to share with you that at the end of January 2021, what is believed to have been the youngest victim of Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, was finally identified. Since her remains were found in a wooded area next to a baseball field on the 21st of March 1984, Jane Doe has been known as Bones 10, having been killed at least a whole year earlier. Investigators knew nothing of her story, only that Ridgway eventually confessed her murder without knowing her identity. At the end of January, it was announced that her name was Wendy Stevens. She was just 14 years old. She was finally identified when the DNA Doe Project used DNA extracted from bone fragments to develop a familial genetic profile that helped King County investigators identify the remains. The genetic profile was uploaded to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA in search of potential blood relatives. Although there were no direct matches found, they did find multiple distant cousins on both sides of the family tree. They then built out the family tree in search of any common ancestors here, leading eventually to Wendy's parents. They notified her mother, who then travelled to give a DNA sample, which then confirmed Jane Doe's identity as Wendy Stevens once and for all. In a very strange twist, according to the Seattle Times, her mother had actually already uploaded her own DNA to GEDmatch back in February 2019, hoping that would help her learn the fate of her missing daughter. But shortly after this, GEDmatch changed their opt-in policy, which only allows law enforcement access to the DNA database if the users explicitly agree to it. Her mother didn't realise this change had happened. Had she done this, the case would have been solved immediately on the upload of Wendy's DNA. Wendy was said to have run away from her parents' house in Denver, Colorado, aged 14 in 1983, and likely became a victim of Ridgway not long after. Her family spent decades wondering what happened to their daughter, not knowing if she was dead or alive. Finally, they have closure, even though it's probably not the answers they wanted. Samuel Little was thought to be the most prolific American serial killer of all time, beating only the aforementioned Ridgway. He targeted the most vulnerable women in society, sex workers who he knew would not be missed, and therefore he went undetected for decades. Although he was only convicted of 4 counts of murder, he confessed to 93, of which the FBI had been able to verify at least 50, maybe even 60. A lot of the time serial killers tend to exaggerate on their crimes for some kind of notoriety, which is what I'm sure investigators thought when Little was arrested, but that wasn't the case. His stories very much seem to work out. I'm including him in this video because on the 30th of December 2020, Samuel Little died in a Los Angeles hospital. It was well known that he had many health conditions, and the FBI were trying to get as much information out of him as possible in regards to his victims before his death. I really hope they got everything they possibly could. Although his cause of death doesn't seem to have been announced publicly, he did suffer from diabetes, heart problems and other health conditions, so it could have been anything. And then we have something huge that happened in the Zodiac case, something which I'm sure the majority of you have already heard about. The FBI have confirmed that one of the ciphers was finally solved 51 years after it was originally sent to the San Francisco Chronicle by the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac is still unidentified to this day and was responsible for at least 5 murders in Northern California in the late 60s. He gained the notoriety that he did because he sent letters to the police and media along with some clearly very difficult to solve ciphers. Up until December 2020, only one had ever been solved. But this latest cipher to be solved was sent to the Chronicle on the 8th of November 1969 and was finally solved by 3 people from the US, Belgium and Australia. This newly solved cipher reads, "I hope you're having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show. Which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner, because now I have enough slaves to work for me where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise. So they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life is life that will be an easy one in paradise death." The FBI released a short statement saying that the cipher had been solved but they had no more information. I'm not sure if this being decoded will lead to any huge breaks in the case, but it just goes to show that it's worth not giving up on things like this. I don't think the Zodiac would have been stupid enough to actually leave any huge clues in his ciphers. I think they were just all a part of his game, but you never know. The case is still open. I think that if I could solve any case in the whole world, it would be this one. The Zodiac fascinates me. And finally, on the topic of serial killers, we have the Claremont Killer, a man who terrorised the suburbs of Perth, Australia in the 90s, murdering 2 or 3 victims. It's not entirely clear as one body is still yet to be found. The victims were Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon. In 2016, Bradley Edwards was arrested in relation to these murders, but his trial didn't begin until 2019. As I filmed my original video back in October 2019, I think the trial was weeks away from starting, where he pled not guilty to the charges against him. However, on the eve of his trial, he did actually plead guilty to sexually assaulting 2 young women in 1988 and 1995. It was through this 88 attack that led to his eventual capture as the Claremont Killer, leaving DNA on a silk kimono that he took from the washing line. The DNA matched swabs taken at the 1995 assault and the materials found under the fingernails of Kira Glennon. Fibre evidence also showed that both Kira and Jane had been in Edwards' work van shortly before their deaths as well. This was Perth's longest running and most complex criminal investigation ever, which finally concluded on June 25, 2020. The trial took 7 months and heard evidence from more than 200 witnesses. And he was actually found guilty of the murders of both Kira and Jane. But because the body of Sarah Spears has never been found, there was not evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to prove his guilt in that one, although the judge did say it was more likely that he was involved in her disappearance than not. On the 23rd of December 2020, Bradley Edwards was sentenced to life imprisonment, not eligible for parole for 40 years, so he will probably die in prison as he's now in his 50s. I can only hope that at some point before he dies, he admits where Sarah's body was buried, as her family deserves some closure in this case. Back in September 2018, I uploaded a video on the case of Nicky Verstappen, an 11-year-old boy from the Netherlands who disappeared from his tent at a summer camp in August 1998. His body was found in woodland the next day. His case went unsolved for 20 years and his name was only kept in the public eye by a crime reporter who refused to give up. I got quite a lot of flack for that video at the time as I labelled it a solved case when there hadn't actually yet been a trial. But I can now announce that there has been a trial and Joss Breck has officially been charged with kidnapping and the sexual abuse of Nikki, although he was not found guilty on the manslaughter charge, which isn't quite the result everyone wanted. Sadly, Breck was only sentenced to 12.5 years imprisonment, which has proven to be incredibly controversial. Breck was captured when he was found to be a DNA match to the unknown DNA found on Nikki's clothing after his death. It was announced earlier that year that 21,500 men in the Limburg province in the Netherlands, where the murder happened, were being asked to give samples of their DNA in an attempt to finally get this case solved. Breck actually went missing from his home in the April of that same year and didn't respond to any requests for his DNA, and his immediate family also refused to give DNA, which is very interesting. Police did manage to retrieve samples of his DNA from personal items though after he was reported as missing. He had a known history of sexually abusing children and was known to have been near the scene when Nikki died, so he was very much a person of interest. He was finally located and arrested in Spain in August 2018. The trial finally began on the 28th September 2020, where Breck pled not guilty on all 3 charges. He said that the only reason his DNA was found on the body was because the day that Nikki died, he was walking in the forest and saw something in the distance and went to look at it, finding Nikki's body. Breck said that he checked for signs of life and touched the body, during which time he must have left his DNA, but then he left because he knew that he'd be thought of as a suspect because of his previous convictions. However, this DNA wasn't only found on the outside of Nikki's clothing, it was also found in his underwear, to which Breck had no explanation. It was also said that it wouldn't have been possible for Breck to see Nikki's body from the distance, as it would have been hidden by trees and a chain link fence. As I mentioned just a minute ago, Joss Breck did not end up being convicted for Nikki's death. On the 20th of November, the court found him guilty of kidnapping and sexually abusing Nikki, as well as for the possession of child pornography. The DNA found in the body was evidence of prolonged physical contact of a sexual nature. However, because Breck had many previous offences against children in which he had not killed them, he had always let them go, it was argued that he may not have killed Nikki intentionally. Breck had a history of restraining his victims by putting his hands over their mouth, which may have been what he did to Nikki and accidentally suffocated him. I'm not going to lie to you, this aspect of the case confused me slightly because the majority of the information around this case is in Dutch and I couldn't delve into all of the nitty-gritty details as much as I wanted to. He was acquitted of manslaughter, but it was taken into account by the court that Nikki may have accidentally died as a result of Breck restraining him, which here in the UK would have classified as manslaughter regardless. I'm not sure if this is just a difference between our legal system in the UK and the Netherlands. I would love for any Dutch people who follow me to expand on this if you know any more details. Like, if they thought that he might have killed Nikki, why do they not convict him on that? It's very confusing. One of the biggest unsolved mystery stories recently has been that of the Dyatlov Pass case, and how it may have finally been solved thanks to the Disney movie Frozen of all things. Now, this isn't a 100% we know exactly what happened here kind of case, but it's probably more answers than we've ever had before. The Dyatlov Pass incident is something that happened 62 years ago in the Ural Mountains in Russia, when 9 people, hikers, ended up mysteriously dying. Their bodies were later found frozen, scattered around, some were in states of undress, some had their bodies destroyed, skulls and chests open, one was even missing their tongue. There's been so many theories over the years, from UFO abductions to yetis, bears, avalanches, but there was always a reason as to why each theory didn't work. The avalanche theory has always seemed to be the most obvious here, but many argue that the snow wouldn't have been able to cause the kind of injuries that were found. But scientists in Switzerland may have been able to prove this theory possible by using the animation code used to create the snow scenes in Frozen. Using this code, they've managed to create avalanche simulation models, similar to what may have been the case at Dyatlov Pass that day. They wanted to simulate the impacts that avalanches would have had on the human body, and found that the snow, in the exact weather conditions that the hikers found themselves in that night, there was very much a chance the avalanche could have struck them as they slept and could have caused some very serious injuries. It's all a little bit more complicated than that. The National Geographic article that I read this on includes some very technical terms which I struggle to translate. But the important thing is, big slabs of snow falling in an avalanche on top of a human body can absolutely cause wounds similar to blunt force trauma. It was very much a case of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. No huge conspiracies involved at all. We'll likely never know 100% what happened in this case, but this is the closest we have to an answer right now. Quite a while ago, I covered the case of 21-year-old Bethany Decker, who was reported as missing in 2011 after not turning up for work or her university classes. Although it seems that she disappeared in January, she wasn't reported as missing for several weeks, as messages to her friends continued to be sent from her Facebook account. She was 5 months pregnant at the time of her disappearance and already had a son who was being cared for by her parents. Despite being married to her husband, Emil Decker, who was in the army, Bethany had actually been having an affair with a man called Ronald Roldan. The two had recently even moved in together. Ronald was known to be a violent man with a long criminal history, and in 2015, 4 years after Bethany disappeared, he was actually charged with the attempted murder of his then girlfriend after he shot her. This girlfriend later said that he made statements during their relationship that made her think that he was implicated in Bethany's disappearance. Ronald was expected to be deported back to his native Bolivia after he spent his prison sentence for this, but instead he was actually extradited to Loudoun County, where Bethany went missing, and he was arraigned there on abduction charges in relation with her disappearance. Whilst the circumstances around all this aren't very well known to the public as I write this script, there was a probable cause statement filed by the county sheriff that described Roldan telling detectives conflicting stories of what happened to Bethany on the last day he saw her. Bethany made her last phone call at 2:08 p.m. and asked to work an evening shift that day, but of course she never arrived, and her movements after that point are unknown. Roldan told investigators that Bethany left the apartment that afternoon and just never came home, but the probable cause statements read, "The accused was allegedly unaware of Decker's destination or her time of return. The accused was also unable to provide a description of the clothes worn by Decker when she left the apartment." And he also never questioned why her car remained in the car park for days after she disappeared. He didn't wonder where she'd gone. The statement also says how investigators believe that someone was impersonating Bethany on Facebook in the days after her disappearance, which we already kind of knew. Roldan is suspected of being the one responsible for this. As no body has ever been found, at this point it's not clear whether they'll ask the grand jury to indict him on additional charges, including a no-body murder count. But it seems they do definitely think that Roldan was responsible for Bethany's disappearance. I'm also so happy to announce there has finally been an arrest in Alyssa Turney's case. Alissa was just 17 years old when she disappeared. She left a note on her dresser telling her father and sister that she was running away to California with some money she had saved, and that was it. She was never heard from again and never touched any of the money that she had in her bank account. As you can probably guess, Alissa never wrote that note, and for the past several years, Alyssa's incredible sister Sarah has been on a mission to get her father and Alyssa's stepfather, Michael Turney, arrested for Alyssa's disappearance. She discovered that Michael had actually picked Alyssa up from school at lunchtime that day, a fact that he always kept secret. And Michael's just a very weird man. He held this unusual surveillance over the house, he was paranoid, and eventually actually ended up serving 10 years in prison for making 26 homemade pipe bombs and a 90-page manifesto. He claimed in this manifesto that Alyssa had run away, but then she was harmed by 2 men at this electrical union he used to work for. He said that he killed the 2 men who were responsible for this. He didn't. These men actually died of natural causes, and it was all just very weird. It's also thought that Michael may have molested Alyssa for years. And in August 2020, Michael Turney was officially arrested for the disappearance of Alyssa on second-degree murder charges. Michael Turney probably never would have been arrested for this if it wasn't for the incredible work of Sarah, who refused to give up on her sister. As she campaigned and campaigned, she made Alyssa's story as widely known as possible until eventually the police had no choice but to act. I would highly recommend you go and watch my full video on this case. The story is insane, and the way that Sarah just had this determination to get justice for her sister is so admirable. I definitely cannot film an updates video without talking about the potential, maybe possible advancement in the Madeline McCann case, which came out of Germany just last year. I don't really think I need to rehash the details of this case. We all know who Madeline McCann is, a British girl who disappeared in Portugal, aged 3, in 2007. In June 2020, prosecutors in Germany held a press conference to state they had a new lead in the search for Madeline McCann, a suspect who they've named as 42-year-old Christian B. His surname's never been publicly revealed. He was believed to have been in the area in Dyatlov when Madeline disappeared, and is currently serving a jail term in Germany for drug dealing after being extradited from Portugal in 2017. There's also an ongoing case against him for rape, a case which took place in Dyatlov only a year and a half before Madeline went missing. He came to the German police's attention after an anonymous tip-off made in 2017. Apparently he'd made some very disturbing comments in a bar in Germany as he was watching news coverage of the 10th anniversary of Maddie's disappearance. Since then, the police have been following up on this by talking to literally everyone who knew this man around 2007. He had also been investigated in the past over the disappearance of a 5-year-old German girl called Inga, who went missing in 2015. His criminal record covers everything from theft, forgery, drug dealing, firearm offences, rape and sexual abuse of children. He was also said to have been linked to 2 vehicles in Portugal at the time of Maddie's disappearance, and the day after she disappeared, one of these cars was transferred to someone else's name. So we've definitely got a bad guy here who's been responsible for any number of crimes. But the link here to Maddie is loose, but it's the best one they've had for a long time, so hopefully they see it through all the way to the end. This lead has been met with a lot of scepticism, which is understandable, but there could be something in it. 23-year-old Corey McKeague was an RAF airman based in Suffolk who went missing after a night out in Bury St Edmunds on the 24th of September 2016. CCTV last showed Corey walking into a horseshoe-shaped area behind a Greggs and Superdrug, where industrial waste bins were stored. Although there have been many theories over the years, Corey's body was never found. There was an inquest opened at Suffolk Coroner's Court in November 2020, but it got adjourned that very same day, probably due to the pandemic. The pre-inquest hearing was delayed to February 5th and then again April 16th, so the inquest itself won't begin until much later this year. Despite still not being found, the Suffolk senior coroner has said that Corey died in the Suffolk jurisdiction in September 2016. The chief superintendent has told the hearing that it's believed that Corey climbed into a bin that was emptied into a waste lorry, where he subsequently died. Although it's long been suspected that this was Corey's fate due to his mobile phone taking the same route as the bin lorry, this inquest should be able to provide some closure for his family, a sign that they should just stop looking for him and just accept that that's what happened. And finally, to end with, we have the case of Susie Lamplu, who disappeared over 3 decades ago, last seen on the 28th of July 1986, leaving the Fulham office of the estate agents that she worked for. Susie's diary simply said that she had an appointment at 12:45 p.m. to meet a Mr. Kipper who has never been identified. Her car was found abandoned outside a house for sale and there's never been a sign of her since. There is one prime suspect in her case in the form of John Cannon, who is currently in prison for another murder of a woman called Shirley Banks from Bristol and the kidnapping and rape of another woman in Reading. He's said to be one of the most dangerous men in Britain, and there's no doubt that he's responsible for many other crimes. But was he responsible for the murder of Susie? Cannon has always denied involvement, but he would do. New evidence spoken about in a Channel 5 documentary suggests that a lorry driver saw someone who looked a lot like Cannon carrying a very heavy bag on wheels and subsequently dropping it in a river. This lorry driver went to the police about what he saw at the time, but no action was ever taken despite him going back several times. Earlier this year, Susie's brother Richard appeared on a podcast called The Missing, in which he's appealed for any information on her final movements. He says the trail was starting to get very cold and this is a last-ditch attempt for him to find his sister. They're looking to speak to anyone who saw Susie on the day she disappeared, particularly on Sherwood's Road in Fulham. Anyone who can shed light on Mr. Kipper, and anyone with any information about John Cannon and his movements in July 1986. They think someone must have seen something, somebody must have seen Susie at some point that day, somebody must have seen John Cannon at some point that day. They're just trying to piece together the final piece of the puzzle, because whilst they are sure that it was John Cannon, they don't know this for certain. It could have been anyone else. They're just looking for anyone at all to come forward with information. And that's all of the updates I have to share with you today. Hopefully I've covered everything I needed to, but if you know of any other updates on cases I've covered in the past, please feel free to leave them in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching this video. Before we go, I just want to end on a quick note about the pins that I sell, my not merch pins. I always have my pin store linked in the description box down below, but just to let you guys know that I am down to the final dregs of my true crime pin once again, and my forget me not pins. If you guys are interested in getting those, then I would get on that fairly quickly. Just thought I'd let you know. The forget me not pins are actually for charity. 50% of the proceeds are going towards a charity here in the UK called Missing People, and it's for a wonderful cause. And yeah, that's it. That's everything I want to say, I suppose. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys.